and you record this. So now if you say something bad, you're on film and I can show it to the bishop. More likely it'll go the other way. So last week, what I suggested we may do today, we talked a little bit about versions of the Bible, and it was really amazing. I mean, it was probably the best lecture I've ever given. Sorry if you missed it. But I thought we might talk a little bit about how we got the Bible that we got today as a broad brush. And then when we get our books, we'll dive right into them. But we may end up also having a little bit of time about, honestly, some key chronology, because we don't always get that this thing, the order it's in is not the order it was written, and it's not the order chronologically it's addressed. It's a little bit slipshod how we got this thing put together. So this is not going to work, guys. We need to get us all together. So, all right.
That's on the table.
Let's see how we can do this. We can squelch up some chairs.
Or we could add another table.
All right, camera, come on.
You wanted diversity, you got diversity.
I want diversity. You better believe I want diversity.
Oh, I know you do. I'm doing my best.
You're succeeding.
We add
table. Look, this is good. We've got engineers in the parish. We know what to do. What do we want to do? Slip over,
or just pull these out and add it.
Pull these out and add one in the middle. That seems good, right? Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna pull your way. I think that's gonna do it. I think that's gonna be good. Here, baby. This is a lovely problem to have.
It is.
Okay, now we can put this back over to make it get up a third time. If you're watching this, you must be really sleepy. Last week we talked about versions of the Bible, and the one date I gave you last week was 1611, and that's when we got the authorized translation of the King James Bible, which I told you was great at the time, but less good, right? Less good because of the manuscript tradition. So I want to go back further than that. Once upon a time, there were these stories. And in the Bible, it starts with like the creation of the world. And guess who saw that? Nobody. So there was nobody to firsthand write that, right? There's nobody firsthand write that. As far as we know, these first people who are called Adam and Eve weren't literate. So they didn't write their own story. So what every scholar will tell you is that the book didn't start as a book. It started as a story. A story, and the way that they like to use this, right, is they talk about something called oral tradition. And look, this still happens today. It's not like everything we do is written down. But way back when, and even this is like 200 years ago, 95% of the population was illiterate. 200 years ago, 95% of the population on the planet was illiterate, even in places like England, right? I mean, this was like a luxury to read and write. So the way people learned stories was through art and this oral tradition, right? So what everybody will tell you about scriptures, everybody will tell you this, is that the stories are older than the writings. So what happens over time is some stories start to become like important stories for the people. And maybe they have a particular teaching or there's an identity aspect to them. And other stories, they're kind of like around the cloud, and maybe people know about them, but they don't end up getting written down as far as we found. And here's the other trick. We don't have like airproof archives. So if somebody wrote a crazy book and thought that was funny, we don't know if they thought that was funny. We're like, look, this was really important. They wrote it down, right? I mean, this is it. Like, we don't know. So these stories happen, and we think that there starts to be a strong written tradition biblically when there is a first monarch. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why that is. The first monarch is a king called Saul. He's not, turns out, a very good monarch. And then he's followed by David, who's not related to him. And most scholars will tell you that's around the year 1050 before the Common Era, or BC. And this is when things start to really get written down. But keep in mind, the things they're writing down are much older than they are. They've been, as I mentioned, passed down orally. These guys are in charge, they're monarchs, and they're in charge of, well, as much power as they can. That's what monarchs like to do. So they have probably some interest in what stories make it. Particularly ones that say monarchs are good, right? You will actually see that show up in the biblical record, that monarchs start to be really, really good. And there's some changes that end up happening even in the stories. And what's interesting is sometimes a story is so good, you could tell it a couple different ways. Let me just give you an example. And if you haven't read this, if you want to have a look, please do. If you open at the very beginning, which for us, you know, we start at the front. If you were reading in Hebrew, you'd start at the back because it's written from right to left. If you read Genesis chapter 1 and you go to chapter 2, verse 4, you get a creation story. But then if you read to the second half of verse 4 up to the end of chapter 3, you get another creation story. And they're a little different, turns out. In this one, God makes separates light and day, light and dark, and then there's a day. That's the first thing that happens. In this one, God makes a garden and waters it, and then makes human beings to like work. Humans come last here. Humans come first as animals here. Some people say, well, that's because God made a world and didn't like it and started over. There's two stories, but very few people say that. What most people say is, look, that's because like the creation of the world tells us what life's about, what the world's about, what God's about. And that's so important. There's probably more than one way to tell them. If you don't mind me digging in do you mind if I dig in the details a little bit? Yeah. Okay. You've read this part, right? You've read this part. Most of you have read this part of the Bible. This one comes first. It's the first thing you read. This one is probably 500 years older. This is a fun thing, right? Like I said, the way it gets put together is not necessarily in order of chronology. Why would I make a claim like that? Well, this tells a little bit about how we end up with the Bible down here. When scholars find old manuscripts and they find old traditions, they don't really know which one's right, because there's not a record that says this is the right one. And if it did, you'd be real suspicious, right? Like methinks the lady does protest too much, right? So there's a couple of things scholars do. First, they pick they like to pick the shortest version. Then they like to pick the most awkward version. Truly. Because what they figure out is over time, when people retell the story, they figure out how to iron it out, right? So if something's a little bit awkward and weird, well, it's like maybe the first draft. And case in point, in this one, God makes human beings out of clay, like a model. And then God gives them really mouth to mouth, like blows air into them, right? Very physically involved. In this story, God didn't touch anything. He did it. God, everything God does, God says, and it happens. But there's no touching, there's no walking in a garden, there's no mouth to mouth. So people say, look, that's a little more awkward. There's another interesting trick too, which is vocabulary. So this is okay to say from the beginning. One of the biggest reasons people say this is the older story is because it uses a name for God that is old. You probably have heard this word before. The word Jehovah. It's a made-up word. It's not actually a real word. It never was. This word was invented by Hebrew scribes to trick people so that they wouldn't say God's name. That story is going to show up on Sunday, by the way, in the lectionary. That's where Moses goes to the burning bush, and God says, tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And Moses says, well, okay, but who's telling Pharaoh to let the people go? Like, they're going to say, what's God's name? And God's response in Hebrew, no one knows what it says. Because it's a bunch of letters that don't make any noise. Hebrew has a couple letters that make no noise at all. But the best guess is what God says is, now this gets written in English because it's, like I said, you're going to look at this and you're going to say, those letters make noise. Mm-hmm. There are these four little consonants here. And look, it's important. Some people will go around and they'll pronounce this word, but our Jewish brothers and sisters don't say that. And they don't write it either. English is a little different from Hebrew. They went to a lot of pain to make sure we didn't say that. Hebrew scribes took this word and they put the wrong vowels with it. There's this word in, you've probably heard this word before if you've been around church, the word Adonai. And Adonai is a lord, kind of like a slaveholder or a plantation master or somebody who has authority in a big building, like they're a lord. There's lots of lords. In fact, the British monarchy is full of lords, right? So lots of lords, then as now. They pulled these vowels and they stuck them with this consonants where they don't belong. They did that on purpose so that nobody would say that word in ignorance, because they believe that name was so holy, if you said it, you would defile yourself. So this is where the word Jehovah comes from. It's got the right letters and the wrong vowels. And sometime we think around the time 540 BCE, Jewish people stopped saying that name and they stopped writing it. So this story has that word all over the place. You can tell in your English translation of the Bible that it's that word if it looks like this, all capital letters. That's not just the translator like trying to mix it up. That means it's like God's actual personal name. And it's such a big deal, right, that people, by the time of Jesus and Jesus himself, may not have written or said that name.
So well, we have the commandment,
don't take the name of the Lord in vain. We think that means, oh God, I stubbed my toe. Don't say that. No, it means don't say that word.
Wait, was that a superstition? Like you're going to get struck by lightning if you say that word?
The kind of the Hebrew understanding is holiness is not something that is meant to be played with. And so there's this story that shows up where David is moving the ark to Jerusalem, and it's really clear, if you touch the ark, you're going to die. Because it's too holy for a human being to touch. So the priests carry it on poles so that they never have to touch it. Well, there's this particular story where it's on an ox cart, and the ox cart hits like a rut in the road, and the ark wobbles, and this man wants to save the ark from falling over. So he runs and he stables the ark, and it doesn't fall, and he dies instantly.
I saw that in Indiana Jones.
You sure did. Yeah.
That's where I learned that you don't touch the ark.
And that's part of this. That's part of this idea. So look, before this time, people did say that name, and they sure did write it, and people still write it today if they're copying the text. But then they have to go through ritual purification because they sense that they have touched something that is holier than they can bear. So there are rabbis who will spend an entire year copying a Bible one to another in Hebrew. Like, that's their job. You pay them a year's salary to do this. And when they write that name, they have to go wash themselves, and they can't sleep in their house with other people. Yeah. It's ritual purity. And that's changed over time. And this is part of what I want you to hear. In the olden days, that wasn't the case. But by this time, people said, that's a big deal. We're not going to say that word. So this is one of the biggest clues that this story is older than that one. This happens actually throughout, especially the book of Genesis. You'll see a story that happens twice. You know that story about Noah? Noah gets up in the ark. How many of each animal does he take? He takes a pair, right? Until you hear the story the second time. And then he takes 7 pairs of clean animals. How did Noah know which animals were clean? Do you know which book tells you which animals are clean? Leviticus. That is written 3 books after Genesis. Right? So it's a clue to you. Now, look, I'm not trying to undo the scriptures. What I'm trying to tell you is sometimes things are so important that they can bear more than one take, right? And that even happens sometimes in the same book. 2 different creation stories, 2 flood stories, but they're a little stitched together. And you know which story's older because it uses that one. The one with the 7 pairs uses a different name for God, actually, which we don't usually say. In Hebrew, this is Elohim, and it just means, I mean, they translate it like this. They either translate it God or they translate it Lord. And those are fair translations. So oral tradition, sometimes this creation story was really meaningful, but this one still meant something together, so why lose it? They tell different things about people that aren't in competition, actually. They're not competing. They have something different to say. So that shows up right from the get-go. Sometimes there's stories in the Bible that pretend like you know something that we don't know anymore. I'm picking on you as a group here, but there's Genesis chapter 6. This is what happens right before the flood. I don't need you to look at it. I'm just going to tell you the story. It says that the sons of God looked down on the daughters of humans and found them real attractive. And then they had babies who became the heroes of old. We don't know who the heroes of old are.
They're the ancient aliens.
Well, there's lots of conjecture. There is.
Ancient astronaut theorists.
Yeah, I mean, my father-in-law thinks they're the aliens that built the pyramids, which is great, except the Bible didn't tell you who they are, because the Bible thinks you already know that. But that information got lost to us. So if you don't mind me saying, there's kind of this like cultural legend or cultural tradition that we don't have all of. Who are the sons of God? Have you heard a sermon on this topic?
I have.
Have you really?
They say they came from heaven, right? They were off the planet. They didn't come from Earth.
You heard a sermon on that?
Yes, I did.
That's amazing.
In the Unity Church.
Oh, okay.
They're pretty loosey-goosey.
I mean, I'm going to tell you, I've been going to church my whole life. I've never heard a preacher talk about this from the pulpit.
Yeah, we did. And they talked about how the creation story of Genesis was around thousands of years before Genesis from the ancient Mesopotamians. And it had, you know, God breathing life into Adam and breathing life into his wife, Lilith.
Oh, now that comes from, okay, I'm glad you're doing this. I'm glad this is really helpful. I'm going to tell you the little story in a second.
That's a great story.
Yeah, it's not in the Bible, is it? If you read the Bible, you haven't read about Lilith because she's not in there.
Took it out.
Yeah, she's in one of these extra biblical sources. It's actually called Midrash that our Jewish brothers and sisters still enjoy reading. They get, it's not the Bible, but they read it next to the Bible, kind of like an appendix, or like, you know, like I'm mentioning to you, sometimes there's gaps, like A, B, and C happen, and then you end up at Q, and like what happened to all those letters? So the Midrash will tell you, like, here's what happened. And sometimes it's really wild.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I know in that Noah movie, like Aronofsky had like a little, but isn't there like an apocryphal book, like
there is
watchers that talk about those people?
It almost made it into the Bible. It's called 1 Enoch.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was going to say, doesn't Paul like actually quote from some of that
Jude
stuff?
does. The entire book of Jude is pulled right out of that book, like copy paste, the whole book. And that one made it in the Bible, but the rest of this didn't. And if you've read it, you should be glad because it is weird. It's like Moulin Rouge.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's really weird.
But it's in like some Bibles, isn't it? Like
1 Enoch is in none Bibles that I know of. I'm going to tell you about those other traditions in a second. It belongs to something called the pseudepigrapha.
okay, I was thinking the Apocrypha.
The Apocrypha is a thing we've got in our tradition as an appendix.
Yeah.
We don't count it as the same level of authority as the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, but we've always included it. The church did until the Reformation.
Okay.
Yeah, but this is a different category of book.
Okay.
Yeah.
This one's like way out there.
Yeah. In fact, the oldest language, I told you last week, all the Hebrew Bible is in Hebrew. That's the oldest language, except for half of the book of Daniel, which is in Aramaic. This one's written in Ethiopic. So it's not in Hebrew or Aramaic. It's in, well, language in Ethiopia, which is a little bit removed. That's the oldest we found it.
Does that predate the Hebrews?
No, this post-dates the Hebrew Bible.
So only the Mesopotamian or predated Hebrews, right?
Yeah, that's right. Sumerians are like 2,000 years older.
Sumerians. They're the ones that had the same Adam, Lilith, and then God got rid of Lilith and then made Eve.
There's not actually a one-to-one map. There's not. What there is, and this is interesting, most scholars will tell you this story came around, I should tell you that timeline. Let me skip forward a little bit. I'm getting down in the weeds. Jim, your mouth's open. Did I really lose you?
No, I'm just mouth breathing.
Oh, okay. Okay, so let me do this, and I'll go back and fill in a little bit. Saul and David start writing stuff down because they're monarchs, and they've got they've sort of got a centralized bureaucracy. And of course, Solomon's the next one, and that's when we think a lot of these writings end up happening that are the oldest ilk. And the oldest ones, we like to use this little letter, J, because in German that makes the Y sound, which is that beginning of that word for God, right? So scholars tell you this is pretty universally accepted. There's one source called J, and then there's another source of oral tradition called E that uses the word Elohim, and here's one of those examples right there. There's another source called D, which is the book of Deuteronomy. If you've read the book of Deuteronomy, it sounds a lot like Exodus, because it is. It's just a retelling of Exodus. And the last one they call is P, and P is what priests are supposed to do and what's clean and what's not clean. All four of those could be in the same chapter of Genesis, but they come from different traditions, and they just kind of got rammed together. That doesn't mean they got rammed together sloppily. What that means is whoever edited this in its final form said, those go together just fine. They go together just fine. We don't have to separate them all. We're going to link them together in story. I'm afraid I'm kind of blathering here, but the goal is to say there's lots of different stories sometimes in the same book. And some of the ways we know that is based on what names they use for God, or whether they start talking about clean and unclean before we even know what that is. Hope that makes sense. You may say, Mike, you're really hurting biblical authority here. And I'm just going to tell you how, in general, Episcopalians read the Bible for 1 second. We do this a lot of different ways. But maybe you've heard of this word before. This word is 100 years old, and it was put out by some kind of rich propagandists, kind of like the Koch brothers, if you know who they are, people who had some big oil money decided that they were going to push this word throughout the rest of the world inerrant, which means that the Bible makes no mistakes whatsoever. I mean, even in punctuation or quotation marks, like if something's a semicolon, don't render it a comma, because that would be wrong. This is 100 years old.
It's not very old.
It's not very old.
Oh, that is very old.
And it's a great idea, except what they say is the Bible's inerrant in the original version. We don't have that. We wouldn't even know if we found the original letter of Isaiah. What would it say? This is the first one? So we don't know. What we've got is stories we haven't heard that eventually got written down, right? And then those got copied. You ever spent a long time copying a thing? Like maybe you did this in a typing class, or you were quoting something. How good's your copying?
High school thing.
Word for word, how good's your copying? Would you say your copying is inerrant?
No.
Especially if you did it for 10 hours a day in a monastery where a guy sat up and read out and you listened. We all learned about this in the second grade. There's things called homophones, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what we've got are copies that largely agree, but sometimes they don't totally agree. Which one's the original one? I mean, we don't know. So what we do with these copies of copies of copies of copies is we try to get as much data as we can, and we say, hey, let's play the percentages, right? Like, what's the biggest percentage? How old does the manuscript appear to be? So we like older more than we like newer. That was the problem with King James Bible. Oldest manuscript came from 1400. So 211 years old. Since then, we discovered some that are like from the 1st century BCE. Actually, the oldest thing we've got is a little piece of silver that is from the 4th century BCE that has part of Isaiah on it. So 300s BC is our oldest piece of text that we've got.
Why would it be on a coin?
It's not a coin, it was a silver scroll. So
scroll,
they took like a
scroll,
silver
okay.
foil and they carved on that.
Scroll.
Of course, a lot of our scrolls got lost because, well, they're made on papyrus. If you get that wet, it's gone, right? It's just like paper. Vellum, which is a veal skin, vellum is veal, so it was like an aborted calf or one that they slaughtered for the purpose of having like the nice supple hide. That lasts longer than paper, right? But that lasts forever. If you look at the Dead Sea, anybody seen the Dead Sea Scrolls before?
Pictures.
They're just like so tiny. They're just little tiny little things. And they actually used to all be together. And what the people who found them discovered is they'd make more money if they sold little bits of them at a time. So they chopped them up and they sold them and got more money. And then there's people who spend like 40 years in a room looking at one piece of paper that big, taping them back together. That's what they do. I mean, and you can see the first one they found is a whole scroll, and it's amazing. And then you look at like, why did they cut all these other ones up? Oh, because they were able to sell them for more money. So that's kind of how we got it. That's kind of what we found. And here's the great thing. I don't know if this is tenable. I just don't know if it's tenable. Can I tell you one reason why I don't think it is? It's going to sound really silly, and you're going to think I'm nuts. Anybody read the book of Daniel? There's this really big bad king of Babylon in there. Do you know what his name is?
Nebuchadnezzar.
What's his name? Nebuchadnezzar. That's a long one, isn't it? By the time you call that little boy's name, he's already done what he was going to do, right? Here's the real interesting thing. Nobody with that name has ever existed. His name is Nebuchadnezzar. Now, you might be saying, well, that's just what they called him. That's fine. That's an error. So if it's all or nothing, you get nothing. But that's a new idea. Jesus didn't believe in inerrant scriptures. What people said is, and we still say this, the scriptures hold all things necessary for salvation. So sometimes we use these other words like the scriptures are infallible when they make truth claims. or the scriptures are trustworthy. Scriptures are trustworthy. But I do think it's important to say at the outset, maybe you know this, has God written anything in the Bible? Like
Nope.
God written anything?
Nope.
There's actually two things God wrote. First go on those 10 words God gave Moses. God wrote those. Like with God's own finger, says the text, wrote those words. And then there's one other time God writes a thing. Shows up in the book of Daniel. God puts some handwriting on the wall, like a hand appears and writes words on a wall that basically says, sucks to be you, right? and then it does. It actually does, right? It doesn't go well, right? So what I'm trying to say is God knows how to write. God's literate. But God wrote those two things, not the rest of us. So how did we get this? Well, people were inspired by the Holy Spirit, and they wrote. Yes, sir.
So how do we accommodate the phrase of God breathed?
It's so good, right? That's how we use it with inspiration. Inspiration, literally like, and it goes really well with this word here. Sounds like this in Hebrew. So God makes the clay person and goes like this. And then the clay goes, and becomes alive. And the clay is God breathed. So this is a cool thing you'll hear on Sunday. I'm ruining my own sermon, and I preach it every year anyway. Rabbis say, don't say that word. It's holier than you. And rabbis say, that's the first thing you say when you come out your mouth. You go, oh. And the last thing you do, you say God's name and your life leaves you. So rabbis say that's what God breathed means. It means inspired. It means full of life. So I don't know that there's a lot of life in that. I think there's a lot of life there. I don't know if that makes sense. The problem is this could be true, but we don't have the original ones. So what we've got's got to be enough. Otherwise, God would have carved it in iridium because we couldn't scratch it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, we tend to use those terms, inerrant and infallibility, in the same breath, and that almost negates itself, I think, because the human context is a question. So I agree with you.
And I think sometimes, honestly, because I grew up in a tradition that this is what we said. And if there was one thing wrong with the Bible, the whole thing was wrong. And that's just extreme thinking and not very helpful to the rest of life. I mean, it's just not, right? It's not helpful. I don't think there's a lot of life in that. If your spouse does one thing wrong, you don't love them anymore? Boy, nobody'd be married more than like a minute, right? I mean, thank you, right? But that's just not true to life. And I think sometimes we say it's all or nothing, or God can't put up with imperfection. But like the last couple sermons I heard over here were about that God doesn't mind imperfection. And I actually have come to trust that, right? Because otherwise there's no hope for anybody in the room, especially me, right? So, I mean, I think this is actually really a lovely thing. And for the longest time, I mean, I'm telling you, this is 100 years old. So what happened the first 3,000 years and what still happens if you're Jewish? This is really a lovely thing and a good way to talk about how I hope we do this. If you're Jewish, you know you're disagreeing with the guy at the table next to you. You know you're disagreeing, and you know you're coming back to disagree with them again next week. So they're not interested in uniformity. They're interested in unity. The unity is, we're in this together, and I'm going to come back next week. And I still may not like what you want to say, and I'll see you the week after that. But we don't take our toys and go home. We disagree in community. And we show up again. And there's this lovely thing that the rabbi said, and it's going to sound anti-Semitic when I say it, but so just hold on. Anytime you have two Jewish people talking, you're going to have three opinions. You're going to hear the thesis from the first. You're going to hear the counterpoint from the second. And if they listen, they both leave with a new understanding. Now, that seems really helpful to me, particularly when we think about how the whole book got put together. I know I'm meandering a little bit, but if you've read the book, Ezra, Nehemiah say, to people who are Jewish, Canaanite people are bad. If you married a Canaanite woman, put her outside the city, and any kids you had with her, put them outside the city. They'll corrupt your faith. They'll water you down. They'll get you doing foreign practices. They're not good for you. And then there's this lady in the book of Joshua called Rahab. She's a Canaanite prostitute, and she has more faith in God's deliverance of the city of Jericho than, well, the army. So that one's not bad. And there's this lady called Ruth, who's a Moabite. A Moabite means she's not Hebrew. And she's more faithful to her mother-in-law than the Hebrew sister-in-law. So that one ain't bad either. So maybe in general, people can be corrupting influences, but not always. Well, geez, it sounds like you're talking about errors in the Bible. Actually, I think what we're talking about is a holy conversation. Often this is the case, and there's exceptions. And look for the exceptions. So,
which is right and wrong.
I'm so glad you asked that. I'm so glad you asked that, because that's where I want to hear.
I said, but
who's to say which one's right and which one's wrong? And the truth is, they could both be right and wrong at the same time, depending on which people we're talking about.
Oral tradition.
Well, what's great about oral tradition, right, is that it reminds us that the Bible actually, maybe this is where I should have started. Bible, in Greek, it shows up in plural. This isn't the book, this is the books. Plural, books. So we call it the Bible like it's singular. No, in Greek, this is plural, the books. There's 66 of them. Sometimes they don't seem to be fully in alignment with each other. And we could say, oh, that's because you're a human being and you don't have enough faith. Or it could be, just like when we talk about what's the right policy for ending hunger and insecurity in our neighborhood. Well, I don't know that there's one solution that's going to fix that in every neighborhood. Do you?
Yeah.
I don't know that there is. But I do know that there's some really important conversation points to have in any community. This is maybe a little bit tough, but I want you to hang with me here. So this is how it goes, right? Oral tradition. We get stuff written down. We decide we shouldn't use God's name. And then Hebrew doesn't work anymore. People don't know what it means. It's like Latin today, or like Sanskrit if you live in India. People start speaking Aramaic. So who speaks Hebrew? Just the priests, like 0.1%ers, right? And a lot of this written tradition becomes a thing that happens in the temple only, and regular old folk don't know the finer points of their religion. It's wrapped up in the ivory tower. That's happened throughout history, right? That's part of why we had the Reformation. We said, no, like peasants have a right to read the scriptures. That's how we ended up with the English translation of the Bible, right? Because nobody else could understand the Mass, including the priests. They were illiterate too. They were just up there mouthing words, right? So this is why we have these revolutions throughout time that say, let's get it in the vernacular. All right, that happened from Hebrew to Aramaic. We don't, still, we go with the older ones when we translate the Bible. We go with the Hebrew text because they're older than the Aramaic ones. I mentioned to you last week, no one was doing this anymore after Alexander. We translated that to Greek. Mm-hmm. And that happened in the year, I'm afraid I'm going to get this wrong. I'm just going to say it happened in the 1st century. It's great getting old, isn't it? BCE. Here's what happened. Not a lot of people were speaking Hebrew anymore. They had to speak Greek to exist in the empire because Alexander required that. So they got 70 rabbis from all over. Jewish people spread out in Babylon, in Spain, in Egypt, in what we now call Israel. And they locked them in a room by themselves and said, you translate this Hebrew to Greek. 70. And the miracle was every single one of them translated it the same. And it's a super miracle because 2 Jewish people never agree about anything. So 70 did, and it became this miracle called the LXX, or the Septuagint. And some people said it was an even better version than the Hebrew because 70 rabbis agreed. And it turns out anytime the New Testament quotes the Hebrew Bible, it quotes those. Because Paul, we don't know if he, it's going to sound funny when I say this, we don't know if he could read Hebrew because he didn't write anything in Hebrew. He wrote everything in Greek. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they didn't quote the Hebrew text. They only quoted the Greek one. I mentioned to you last week, after a while, people couldn't read Greek anymore. So Jerome gave us the Vulgate, Latin, Vulgate, vulgar, like only barbarians speak that crap. That happened in the 3rd century of the Common Era, or AD. And then we didn't get English until William Tyndale in the 1400s. John Wycliffe, those are the people who gave us that. So we've made these movements. And the other things we started to realize is, hey, there's books that didn't make it in the Bible. You've probably heard of some of these. They show up in Newsweek like every year. There's the Gospel according to Thomas. And there's the infancy Gospel according to Thomas. And there's the Gospel according to Peter.
I love some of the stories of Jesus' childhood.
Yeah,
because our Bible doesn't say anything about when he was in kindergarten, but those do.
Yeah, I will tell you though, in those stories, he's kind of a brat. I mean, he's kind of a jerk.
Off and does magic tricks.
He does mean things. Can I tell you one of those stories?
Yes.
The infancy Gospel of Thomas. Jesus is playing hide and seek with his friends, right? And they're all hiding, and they go into one of the house, and they say, "Don't tell Jesus we're hiding." So sure enough, mom plays along, and Jesus comes in and says, "Oh, the friends are in here, aren't they?" And she says, "No, no, those are the goats that you hear, young Jesus." And Jesus says, "Just as you have said, so shall it be." And he turns them into goats. I'm glad I didn't make it in the Bible. I just got to be honest, right? Because that's something I would do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's just tough, right?
The little bird.
Oh, and then there's a day where Jesus on the Sabbath, he's breaking the Sabbath because he's making birds out of clay. And the rabbi says, "Aha, look, you're working on the Sabbath. You're making clay facsimiles, images, idols, and on the Sabbath." And Jesus says, "Whoop, there it is." And then they turn into birds and they fly away. So he's fine. A lot of these stories, Jesus is very adversarial with adults. So, like I said, I'm glad they didn't make it. Some of them are new. Some of those got written like in the Middle Ages. Some of them actually are really, really old. Some of them are old. And maybe you're wondering, when did we decide what made it in and what didn't make it and how they made that decision?
So who made the decision?
Who? It's a great question. So most people will tell you that the Hebrew Bible, and look, this isn't quite right, but it's good enough, right? There's kind of a council of rabbis in the year of 70 at this place called Javna or Jamnia. And that's kind of when the Hebrew Bible gets fixed in the Jewish tradition. I mean, give or take. It's not perfect. There are some books that didn't make it in that people continued to read and said, "To heck with y'all, this is important to me." Some of those could be in the Apocrypha. Yeah, right? 70 that one. Does anybody know when the Christian Bible, like the one I got on the table when we got that one set? We did it by a council, an ecumenical council. Bishops and priests from all over kind of the northern Christian world got together to vote on this.
Isn't that where they adopted the canon? What they called the canon?
That's when we adopt the final Christian canon. It happens in 381 at the Council of Constantinople. There was kind of a recommended list at the Council of Nicaea in 323. But this is when it kind of gets set. And there's some books that barely made it in. No, that one did. That one wasn't. In fact, Martin Luther hated this one so much, he puts it last in the German Bible. The book of James, Martin Luther hated that book. And he tried to cut it. And at Constantinople, it almost did not make it.
Because it says faith without works is dead.
Exactly. And Martin Luther hated that.
Because what?
Faith without works is dead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because Martin Luther wanted it all to be about grace. That's because he was neurotic. I mean, this is the case, right? He was neurotic. And his whole life was about, how do I know I'm doing enough? I'm working my butt off, God. I don't feel like I'm good enough. So Luther said, it's not about what I do, it's about what God does. And then James says, well, faith without works is dead. And Luther's like, no, 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 no. I just got grace. You can't go. You can't tell me that. So that's James.
Every time you say Martin Luther, you're waiting to say King.
Sorry. There's this other book that you can read on the internet if you want to, and it almost made it in. It's called The Shepherd of Hermas, and it's like several visions that are very Moulin Rouge as well. I mean, if you think Revelation's hard to read, give that one a go. It's wild, and it almost made it. Almost. So.
Mike, you know about the book called The Cloud of Unknowing?
I don't.
Yeah, that's some early Christian stuff put together like this.
And
anonymous, and it's Be Thou, and I'm listening to it.
Okay, is it fun?
It's kind of fun to hear the same learnings.
Okay.
That Be Thou way back then. Yeah.
Well,
didn't some of the early Christians really not like Revelations and thought it was kind of marginal too? Like,
yeah, it was a little bit on the edge too, but James was the most on the edge. And not only did this one almost make it in, but 1 Enoch was around by this time, and it almost made it in. And like I told you, the book of Jude, which made it in, is totally contained in that book.
Yeah.
So part of it made it, and the rest of it is really weird. Like, I mean, it's really weird. Like, it tells you without a doubt, the solar calendar is 360 days. So I'm like, again, like a little bit of sigh of relief that we didn't do that to ourselves, you know.
There's some interesting books in the Catholic Bible that are not in the Protestant Bible.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in a second, because it is very interesting, and that's an important history. How these guys choose? Well, they prayed, and the Holy Spirit guided them, and they used the following human faculty decisions. Number one, were these books widely being used? So, if only the city of Alexandria used this, and 90% of the rest of the people didn't use it, it didn't make it. Had to be an apostolic writing. Paul, Matthew, Mark wasn't an apostle, but Luke, John, this sort of thing. It had to be linked to the teachings of the apostles to make it into the Christian Bible. And it also had to kind of congeal. So if you got 20 books that you were like, this is good, and book 21 says you should like dance on the Sabbath naked with some sparklers, that one wasn't gonna make it because it didn't line up. So what I want to say is, like, there's an accounting. These are the criteria the council used in addition to prayer and discernment from the Holy Spirit. So it's all of those go together, right? Some of the books didn't make it into the canon. And this is when we use the book canon. Canon means it's a reed. It's like a measuring stick, right? So they didn't quite measure up. But the other part we use the word canon to say is you should be able to measure your life against these books. Like your life and your discipleship and faithfulness, you should be able to measure up against these and get a true mark of where you are and how God would like us to be measured. There was a whole set of books that we call the Apocrypha that didn't make it into the canon, but have always been adjacent and always contained with them, because, you know, the last book of the Hebrew Bible maybe ends in 167. And then the earliest writing we've got from Paul is probably from the year 50. So what do you know? That's like 200 years unaccounted for. Great news. That tells you what happened in some of that time. So this was always included as an appendix until we had this Reformation, right? And if you know a little bit about the Reformation, Martin Luther was one of the ones who started that. He translated the Bible into German. By the way, also the Apocrypha included that. And the Roman Catholic Church wasn't really enjoying this. And they decided they were going to have what's called a counter-reformation. And at the Council of Trent, the Pope decided to show that the Pope had more power, I think that's really correct, actually, than Scripture. So here's how the Pope did that. He said, that's Scripture, done. So if you want to know why that's in the Catholic Bible, because of the Council of Trent, where the Pope is showing when the Pope speaks ex cathedra from his bishop's chair in St. Peter's, he's infallible. For the rest of us, we keep it in Apocrypha. If you grew up Southern Baptist, you don't read that. It's not in my NIV study Bible, because we said that seems real Catholic. But for the first 1,500 years, Christians always read that alongside all the rest of that. So we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater over one person's political ploy to assert their dominance over Christendom. It was probably well-intentioned. Anybody read the Apocrypha, by the way? I mean, look, it's all right. Like you want to read what was going on with the Maccabees? Read the Maccabees. That's interesting story. Yeah. And there's this lady called Judith. I mean, there's some wild stories. Like Judith kind of seduces this general and kills him right before, she kind of like uses her feminine wiles to get him to trust her, and then she cuts his head off. Like it's like interesting girl power stories in there. Yeah. So and we do sometimes read them from the lectionary. We might read Baruch or the Book of Wisdom. We might have certain parts that we'll read. In fact, there's one that often shows up at an Episcopal funeral that comes from the Book of Wisdom. So again, we don't say that they're the same as Scripture, but they come alongside it. That's been kind of the traditional position since the Council of Trent. Now, there's a really interesting thing that happened. When Martin Luther got on trial at the Diet of Worms, right? They were trying him as a heretic, which meant they were going to burn him alive, right? Martin Luther says to the Diet of Worms, hey, everything we do as Christians should be sola scriptura, right? Only the Bible. And the grand interlocutor, who was on the Roman side, right, Johannes Tetzel, said, that's really great, Martin, but how do you think we got the Bible? And of course, the Roman answer was tradition. You're Protestant, you're sola scriptura, low Protestant. If you're Roman, you do scripture and tradition. If you're Episcopalian, you add reason into it. And if you're Methodist, you add this fourth category called experience, even though that's part of reason. Wesley did that because he was a romantic. So he was talking about this intangible, ineffable pull. But Richard Hooker, the one who gave us these three, included experience and reason. Now, this is really interesting, right? Because if tradition gave you the Bible, then the Pope can traditionally make the apocryphal part of the Bible. And that's kind of how that thinking goes, right? And this is an interesting position, except it doesn't work unless you've got some of that going, right? You've got to have some of that. You got to have some of it. Because the Bible doesn't interpret itself, right? It's written in language that requires context and fluency, right? And part of what we're going to get to do, right, is not only is Bible written in language, it's written to a particular time at a particular place with a particular time frame in mind, and a lot of that we don't know. Think about the parables of Jesus. A lot of them are about farming. Anybody farmed in the room? I've planted like green things in the yard, they die. How about animal husbandry? Anybody been a shepherd? Yeah, see, a lot of it we don't get because we don't do that. We just don't do that. So in some ways, we kind of have to decode what's going on in the scripture. What did that mean then so that we know now what that can mean for us? Great example. You heard that parable about the lost sheep before? If a shepherd has 100 sheep, one of them wanders away. What will the shepherd do? Leave it. The shepherd will leave it. I'm telling you, the shepherd will leave it. What does the shepherd in the parable do? He goes and looks for it, right? Which means he exposes the other 99 to danger, right? Whose fault is it that the sheep wanders away? Well, it's the sheep's fault. We think the sheep are dumb. What a selfish sheep. You know, just pay attention to the rest of the group. I mean, I learned that. That's what I learned. But it is exactly the shepherd's fault, because shepherd domesticated sheep to trust the shepherd. Domesticated sheep are dumb, but we made them that way. Like, we as human beings made wild sheep stupid so that we could be in charge of them. A wild sheep does not go, yeah, when it smells a wolf, because it understands that's alerting the wolf to right where I am. A domesticated sheep goes, ah! We did that to them. We did that. Wild sheep don't wander off. That's where they live. They go looking for water. That's what they do. Domesticated sheep, well, when they wander, they're going to probably die because they don't know where to find. They don't know, they're just senseless. They don't know where to find water. They don't even know where to find more grass. That's hard to believe. But we did that to them. So the shepherd's not fixing the sheep's problem. The shepherd's fixing the problem he made. Haven't heard the sermon on that except for here. Because, right, we've lost a lot of that original context. We don't live like that anymore. Which is not to say we need to go do that. It just means we have to be a little bit careful and thoughtful about what's going on. And when we read 1 Corinthians, which is what we're doing, right, it's helpful to know that Corinth was one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient world because it sat on 2 bodies of water and controlled a lot of the Aegean commerce on both ends. It had 2 safe ports. Corinth had, maybe you know this, not one of the wonders of the ancient world. That was in Ephesus, but it sure did have kind of a religious, it was a religious epicenter of silversmiths, of temples. Anybody been to Greece? Yeah, I mean, Corinth is pretty centrally located to get all around, whether you're going to islands or the mainland. So it's a universal trade hub. And guess what else? Because it's got all of that port stuff, it's full of sailors. Jim, tell us about sailors. Yeah, I mean, look, then as now, the reputation holds, right?
Yeah.
Sailors tend to be pretty rough. And guess what? That's what was going on in Corinth. So when we read that, these are people who kind of are salty people, and Paul is trying to turn them into the salt of the earth. Did he need to do that in Athens? I mean, I guess so, but in a very different way. Athens is a landlocked place. It's got universities, right? It's where people go to debate. It is not a home of sailors, right? So that context is a little bit helpful, who Paul is writing to and for what reason. And we'll get to talk about that a little bit more, I think, when we get next time. There's like 2 minutes left, and I did a lot too much talking. And I might have unnerved you here. So now's my chance to circle back.
I'll tell them without being a sailor.
Yeah, you better do that later. We got children in the room.
And it is being recorded.
That's true. I feel things the bishop doesn't know.
He knows, Jim. Yeah, he knows. Well, thank you for your patience. I'll try. Again, the goal is that we're going to talk to each other, not me talk to you. But I'm stalling while our materials get here. And I, like I said, I hope this is somewhat helpful. And what I want to make sure I'm really clear on, I'm not trying to erode biblical authority. I'm just trying to make it realistic. I mean, the thing is, like as Christian people, we're called to be real people, not fake people. Right? And I had a conversation with somebody this morning that was really interesting. They're relatively new to our community, and they used to go to a church that was, I think, probably a really lovely church, but had really like strict scrutiny. And this person said, you know, we used to pull up to our old church, and my partner would say to me, just a little bit afraid of meeting these people because I might find they're not who they're purporting themselves to be, and I'd be really disappointed. I'd be disappointed to find they're human. Yeah. And I want to say, I've grown up in that mentality, and when we have to be perfect, it is really disappointing when we find out that we're not. if perfect means we never make a mistake. But if perfect means not that we're always right, but that our goal is to get it right, and that God chose to be embodied in skin, so we get to be embodied in skin. We don't have to be something we're not. We can be holy in our skin. Well, that seems like a really important frame. It seems really important. Yeah, I do. I want to be right. But if I have to be right, somebody else has to be wrong. And I don't get to make mistakes and learn from them. I'm afraid of making mistakes. And I'm afraid of God. If I have to be right all the time, I have to be afraid of God. Instead of God says, there you go. How about we get it right now? How about we get it right? And that just seems to fit for me. And so last thing I want to say about all this when I say Bible is books. Our Jewish brothers and sisters have always said there's 60, well, they don't use 66, but there's 66 of these, but when you read, there should be 67. Because you're having a conversation with the rest of these, and your voice matters. And look, in the room, 18, there ought to be 84 books in this room. 84. Because having a holy conversation is what matters. How do we know we get it right? When there's joy, when there's life and there's love, and it doesn't prey on somebody else to get those things. I mean, that's what I think. We'll see if we got the books next week. Thanks for your time.